Hi everyone, it's Joanna Henderson, and I want to thank you for joining us today to talk about measurement-based care and Youth Wellness Hubs Ontario. I'm going to walk you through a series of slides and provide you with some background around why Youth Wellness Hubs Ontario thinks measurement-based care is so important and why it's a key piece of our model. Just to make sure we're all on the same page about Youth Wellness Hubs Ontario, and maybe for those of you who are less familiar, we're an initiative that is aiming to transform our system of care for youth with addictions and mental health issues here in Ontario. We offer early intervention services with the goal of identifying early in a young person's difficulties, the need for service, and making those services available. Our services focus on young people aged 12 to 25, and they're designed to really reflect where young people are at this stage in their life, and that the services are actually created with the developmental stage in mind, the challenges young people face, the milestones they're attempting to achieve during this time. And so all of the services are designed to reflect that. It is a model of care that is sometimes referred to as a one-stop shop model of care. So this is where young people can walk in the door and receive a whole wide range of services. They don't have to identify ahead of time, oh, this is about this part of my life or that part of my life. In fact, they can walk in the door, talk to someone about what's going on for them, and we at the back end figure out which services would be best and most appropriate, and we try to ensure that all of those services are right there available in the one location. As I just made reference to, it's a walk-in model of service delivery, so moving away from our conventional approach where there's a long process to actually get service. This is a model of service delivery where young people during the hours that the center is open can just walk in and access care. The resources that are offered and the services that are offered in the context of Youth Wellness Hubs Ontario are really designed to match the level of need. Sometimes we've seen in our system situations where a young person is offered a specific service regardless of whether that actually maps onto the level of need. So we have young people who may not need to see psychiatry, seeing psychiatrists, and we have young people who need to see psychiatrists being unable to access those resources. And so this is really designed to use a stepped care approach to deciding what level of resource should we try first before moving on to the next level. And lastly, the Youth Wellness Hubs Ontario initiative involves standardization across the province. And I say that kind of with a lowercase s as opposed to an uppercase s. Really, the goal is that young people anywhere in the province of Ontario, in the long run, in Joanna's kind of like dream world, that a young person anywhere in the province of Ontario should be able to readily identify in their community where they could get these kinds of services. And when they walk in the front door, they should be reasonably confident that they'll get a somewhat same kind of service, same quality of service, same values underpinning the service, whether they're in Temiskaming or Kingston or Niagara or North Simcoe. So the idea is really that a young person anywhere should be able to walk in and receive some kinds of services that are somewhat standardized, and that those services are really driven by, are we meeting the needs of young people? So one of the key pieces of the Youth Wellness Hubs Ontario model is the use of measurement-based care. And this is related both to standardization and outcome measurement, but it's kind of a bit of a broader perspective. We have here on the screen sort of how it's commonly defined in the academic literature, but you'll see references to measurement-based care in policy sectors, clinical sectors, as well as sort of the research kind of world. So measurement-based care is a systematic, evaluation of symptoms, or in our case, it could be functioning or challenges or needs before or during an encounter, and the use of the results of that evaluation to inform decision-making about the treatment or services at the level of the individual client. Now, one of the challenges certainly is that this language and this idea have really been referred to in many, many different ways across lots of different contexts. So certainly the language and the definition can create some miscommunications amongst ourselves and between sectors. But the bottom line is that we're using a systematic approach to understand what each individual's needs are, and we're using that systematic evaluation or approach to inform, together with other information, but in part to inform decision-making about the services that are offered. One of the strengths of measurement-based care is that it's trans-theoretical. So it doesn't rely on using a particular treatment approach or particular treatment philosophy. You don't have to have a particular kind of training to use a measurement-based approach. And in fact, in some ways, we all, I'm a clinical psychologist by training, we all already do that. We do it in a very sort of qualitative way. When we're operating clinically, we're thinking about what does this young person need, what do I think is the best service to offer or treatment to offer to meet that need, and then maybe each time we meet with that young person, we're thinking about, oh, well, how are they doing? How are they doing relative to how I think they should be doing, and do we need to make adjustments to the treatment? We're all doing that to some extent if we're engaged in clinical care in our heads. But what this does is it really formalizes it, and it doesn't matter if you're from social work or psychology or psychiatry. What it does is it brings some consistency to what are the questions we're asking, making sure we're asking those same questions over time, and linking the answers to those questions to our consideration of appropriate service in a systematic way. And not only is it trans-theoretical, but it's actually trans-diagnostic as well. So you can use this in the context of meeting the needs of young people who are experiencing anxiety or depression or ADHD, or maybe something that's not necessarily diagnostically based. They have high levels of distress. They're experiencing high levels of conflict in their lives. We can use it in all of these different contexts. Some key components of measurement-based care, most importantly, is the focus on the person we're working with. So in our case, the Youth Wellness of Ontario model is focused on working with adolescents and young adults, which we describe generally as youth. So really, this is an approach that engages youth in their own care. It involves, as I've sort of said before, the measurement of what now are called sort of patient-reported outcomes or symptoms or functioning. We don't use that language within Youth Wellness of Ontario, but it is the kind of language that you would see if you're looking to other sectors in reference to measurement-based care. What we really mean by that is these are self-reported measures. So we're actually asking a young person to tell us about how they're doing, as opposed to more conventional approaches where a clinician may be using some kind of approach to decide on whether a diagnosis is warranted or not, or what kind of disorder someone has, or what kind of symptoms they have. This really shifts the focus to gathering information from youth directly using particular measures that are designed for that purpose. It involves the service provider reviewing that information right away. So measurement-based care is not about data collection. It's actually an approach to providing care. So you administer some questionnaires, you gather information using these self-report measures, you review the young person's responses on those measures, you sit with the young person and review their responses together, clarifying things that aren't clear, reflecting back to them their areas of concern, reflecting back to them their areas of strength, and then together using that information to build a treatment plan based on their responses. Those responses, of course, are not the only driver of the decision-making about the treatment plan. Those responses, of course, are taken, are considered in the context of also what you know as an experienced and expert service provider, what the young person knows as with their own lived experience and as an expert in their own life, and perhaps their circle of care. If they have other team members that are part of the service provider team, family members, broadly defined as a young person may define their own family and are part of their care, all of those pieces of information together. So it's not intended to override other pieces, but it is intended to bring an important piece of information to the decision making. So a fair amount, I mean, I would still say that this is an area where there's a growing literature available to help us understand the value of measurement-based care, but we do know some things at this point in time. For clients, it actually can help to increase treatment and service engagement by having that sort of systematic approach and that engagement where you're reflecting on things together, where they see their own voice reflected in treatment planning. It helps understand the challenges that a young person is facing. It actually is an efficient way to gather information about a young person's needs in a way that for many young people is less threatening or less off-putting, in that what we've heard from young people is when they sit in an interview context and are asked questions and they need to answer those questions, they may be afraid to answer a question truthfully because it'll open up a bigger conversation, and they feel like then they have no control over the information that's shared. But through completing self-report questionnaires, then in fact they can answer some questions that they may be reluctant to answer in an interview context because they have more control. They can see how it fits, they can see where it's going, and feel a little bit more sense of control. So it can help us to understand some of the challenges a young person is facing. It eases communication about their experience. It can help to have young people recognize that their experience is also one that others experience, because when you see it on a piece of paper that came into the room prior to you, engaging with service that already existed, it makes one aware that these are the kinds of experiences that young people have. And so it can help to reduce some stigma and help young people to also understand where their experience fits relative to what might be common during adolescence or early adulthood, what might be particularly difficult, or that they, some validation around that they are struggling with something that's particularly difficult to struggle with. And lastly, it can really enhance the rapport with the service provider in that you can feel that this signals that we're interested in them as a whole person, that we're trying to gather information about all different parts of their lives, while at the same time recognizing that they're coming in to talk about one particular kind of concern, and that we're taking those concerns seriously. For service providers, there are also a number of benefits. It optimizes, as I was saying, the efficiency, accuracy, and consistency of assessing needs or symptoms or challenges that a young person is facing, as well as strengths as well. It really greatly enhances, and this is where we have some other slides on the data that support using measurement-based care, but one of its biggest strengths for sure is making the service provider's job easier in terms of actually systematically tracking over time whether a young person is doing better, is experiencing greater difficulty. Humans are very susceptible to filling space, filling gaps with our own perceptions. And sometimes when we're understanding how a young person is doing over time, we can actually lose track of what our comparison points are and what's really going on. So the measurement-based care is particularly useful in this context. It also eases communication amongst service providers. So that and we've seen this and work I've done before with my colleague Gloria Heim, we did a very interesting initiative where we implemented a common screening tool across different sectors in the community, all sectors that are working towards supporting young people. And one of the things we heard was that, people in this situation, people sitting in the housing sector felt like they could identify young people who were really struggling and needed psychiatric care, but if they were to sort of make a referral based on, I think this young person needs psychiatric care because I see this and that and that, they may not have as much traction. They really noticed when they started to use the standardized tool that they were able to say, well, the young person screened positive for this, this, and this. In response to this item, they indicated that they've had this problem within the past month. This seems like it needs psychiatric care. And that really facilitated collaborating communication for those people amongst that team and coordinating care. In the context of Youth Wellness Hubs Ontario, we're working towards offering an integrated model of care where all of the service providers are working together in an integrated way. So collaboration and communication is key, and this really allows different people to be looking at the same information about a young person and reflecting on it together instead of only focusing on an individual service provider's interaction and then their recounting of that interaction. It gives us another piece of information to look at. And like I said before, it helps to inform treatment decisions. It helps us to connect to what do we know. So we may know that from particular kinds of clinical practice or research studies that young people who are presenting with this kind of these kinds of difficulties, as measured by these different measures, really benefit from this kind of approach, and so it can help us to connect into some of that evidence-based care as well. Now, for organizations, and we are doing this as part of Youth Wellness Hubs Ontario, we're leveraging using this information for clinical purposes to then pull it together to look at that information in aggregate to really help us understand the effectiveness of new interventions we might offer or particular treatment components that we might add, or even clinical programs overall. So an example might be, maybe in your organization you offer, dialectical behavior therapy skills groups, but maybe, you're seeing that some young people are dropping off over time, and you're a little bit worried about engagement. Then, by using these kinds of measures, you can get a good sense of where young people are at with their engagement. Maybe then you add a new treatment component. You add, an individual commitment session just prior to starting the group, and see whether that changes people's level of engagement. You can look both at your attendance, but you could also measure their actual levels of engagement. So it can help us look across young people to see, are the things we're doing meeting the needs of young people? Are we having the kinds of impacts we hope to have? It can also help us target areas for professional development and quality improvement. Certainly one of the things out of that same project that I was telling you about before that became apparent through the use of the tool that we were using were the really high rates of difficulties with trauma-related distress that young people were experiencing. And that created an opportunity that wasn't, and I mean, this should matter. It should matter if an individual service provider says, I feel like I need more, I want to go on this training course because I feel like I need more professional development in this area. But we also know that, decision making around those things can be really difficult. When we can show, oh, look, more than half of the young people coming to our service are reporting trauma-related distress, and we don't have the level of capacity that we want to be able to meet that need, it can allow us to sort of then, be much more targeted and advocate much more strongly for resources being directed to professional development in the areas that are relevant to the young people we serve. And lastly, we can use information that's gathered to demonstrate our competency as an organization and the value that we bring to the service sector, both to accreditors but also to funders. So do we have evidence? Are we just doing this because we think it's a great idea? Or do we actually have evidence around measurement-based care? And notably, we actually have evidence that using measurement-based care, so just the act of measuring over time actually leads to significantly improved client outcomes when you compare it to usual care. And that's especially true for people who are not experiencing kind of the optimal or positive responses to treatment initially. So we have, if you think of all of the young people who come in your door, you can think of young people with whom you've worked, I'm sure, and they were able to benefit from the treatment that was offered. And then I'm sure you can also think about young people for whom you offer the treatment that's usually effective, and we have every reason to believe will be effective, but it's actually not effective for that particular young person. So it really helps to those young people experience benefit, because what it does is it uses a systematic approach to identify those young people, which then allows us to take another approach, or to change our direction, or to inquire further about what might be interfering with treatment effectiveness. The other thing that we don't like to talk about, but is the reality, is that we have a certain proportion of the young people we work with who actually get worse over the course of treatment. And of course, that is not that the treatment is causing the deterioration, but things may be unfolding in that young person's life that leads them to experience greater and greater difficulty. When we use measurement-based care, it actually decreases the evidence shows it decreases the likelihood of this happening during treatment. And that's in part because we're able to catch earlier when when young people aren't experiencing benefits from treatment, when they start to deteriorate a little bit, we're able to identify that and get in there quickly, change course, understand what's going wrong, and get on track. So it really serves our most vulnerable clients in a really important way that even exceeds what it does for most clients. It's also been shown to be associated with decreased costs of care, and that probably is in part because it helps to match the right level of care to the level of need, and it also has been shown to result in faster symptom improvement for youth. Now there are, of course, and for those of you who have seen me talk before, I'm always hedging my bets, and I'm always very quick to say, there are no absolutes, and we don't always have all of the information we need. And certainly measurement-based care research, has its limitations as well. We still don't know exactly which components or the frequency with which we want to measure over time are key for getting the treatment outcomes we want and the benefits that we want. Evaluating how to get measurement-based care implemented in robust ways that are sustainable over time are still relatively new and ongoing, so we have a lot to learn from those studies. Most of the research that's focused on measurement-based care is from large integrated health systems. Less is from sort of individual organizations, or in our case, we're, integrated youth service hubs. And so it's we can't point to like, here's where this has been done in one-stop shops, and that's, we know for sure it's gonna be amazing in our context, and that's partly why we go into this kind of work with a curiosity. We have to do it. It's part of, if you're funded through Youth Wellness Hubs Ontario, you'll know that it was your funding was contingent on engaging in using measurement-based care and gathering information about outcomes over time so that we can provide the best care for young people. But we're also learning, and so we put it in place, and we're committed to being curious about it and looking at how is it working, what's going well, what's not going well, how do we need to adjust. And that will allow us both to benefit for ourselves, but also to think about that larger context. And lastly, a lot of the research around measurement-based care has been done in the context of medication, use of medication, rather than psychotherapy. So that's an important limitation, although there are certainly some studies that have shown in the context of psychotherapy that measurement-based care is associated with positive outcomes. There are many more studies that look at medication trials. Definitely, both in my own experience of implementing standardized self-report questionnaires in the context of service delivery and treatment decision-making, I've had the opportunity to hear about lots of barriers, and these barriers have almost always aligned with the barriers that have been reported in the literature as well. For young people, certainly there are young people who come in the door who may have particular kinds of accessibility needs that interfere with their ability to engage with self-reported questionnaires. So it may be that they're experiencing difficulties with their thinking and they're out of touch with reality. They may have cognitive impairments. There may be linguistic challenges. We always need to be thinking about the response burden. And psychology is notorious for doing like 8-hour assessments or something. So that's not what we're doing as part of Youth Wellness Hubs Ontario. We've really worked together with youth over a number of years to really understand where's the sweet spot in terms of getting enough information to guide our service delivery decision making and not be too burdensome. And then also, I think for clients that can be concerned, especially if they're completing something that then continues to exist, who has access to that information, how will it be used? So those are important barriers for us to think about as we work together to implement this in the context of Youth Wellness Hubs Ontario. For practitioners, I think one of the bigger barriers is really around attitudes. We're trained to believe that our judgment, our clinical judgment, is really critical, and it is. But the belief that clinician judgment alone is more accurate than using it in combination with standardized measures isn't borne out in the literature. In fact, we know that it's a combination of the two that's going to get us the best plan and the best understanding. But that sort of like holding on to the idea that I don't need standardized questions, they're not going to add anything, I'm a good clinician, I already know how to do this, that's definitely a big barrier. There are also, of course, people are concerned about anything that takes additional resources. I think in the work we're doing in Youth Wellness Hubs Ontario, it's really designed to not use practitioner resources for anything other than delivering clinical care. There is, of course, an adjustment in And perhaps for some clinicians it'll be new for them to be looking at questionnaire results together with a young person and talking about that or using that as a conversation starter to think about service planning or to think about goals for solution-focused, a single session of solution-focused intervention. But we've really tried to minimize that, but certainly overall time and effort is an important consideration for practitioners. And then I think, at heart sometimes what is of concern, especially when we start to talk about implementing a tool over time to look at how young people are doing, clinicians, understandably as human beings can be concerned that that data will be used to assess their own performance, or they have concerns just generally about how that information will be used. And so those are really important things for us to think about and talk about as each individual Youth Wellness Hubs Ontario site starts to implement measurement-based care, or if you're watching this webinar from another context, when you're trying to implement measurement-based care, that's important to pay attention to. For organizations, of course, if you are using measurement-based care that's not integrated into your existing routines and systems, it can create challenges. We certainly are challenged when we have high staff turnover, because then the need for training new people as they come in this approach and in the tools that are being used can create a resource demand. It's really critical that there's leadership support in implementing a change like this. And when we don't have leadership support, if there are limited resources, high staff turnover, and generally, concern and lack of trust among staff, and certainly we can experience challenges around kind of low organizational readiness for making this change. I feel personally that the folks at the table for Youth Wellness Hubs Ontario, we're very fortunate to have sort of the most passionate, innovative, youth-centered folks, working with us, and so I don't have a lot of concern about some of these pieces, but practically speaking, we need to make sure that we're paying attention to these so that we can be successful in implementing this approach to care. We do know, fortunately, that there are some pieces that are related, they're facilitators related to the success of measurement-based care. The use of what sometimes referred to as patient-reported outcomes or self-report rating scales. These are the structured tools that clients use to report on their own perceptions of their functioning, their symptoms, their distress, their strengths. It's integral, self-reported rating scales are integral to most evidence-based psychotherapy. So all of the kinds of structured psychotherapies that we might use as part of Youth Wellness Hubs Ontario, whether that's CBT, cognitive behavior therapy, or dialectical behavior therapy, or some of the family therapies. Many of these have been evaluated using self-reported rating scales and using measurement over time. It's really important that validated tools are used. So something can look like it's going to do a good job, but ultimately it doesn't actually do the job we need it to do. But we're fortunate that there are many validated tools in existence that help us to understand the severity and changes in severity of most of the common mental health and substance use difficulties. We also have a number of measures that assess quality of life, things like appetite or sleep patterns, family conflict. So there are lots of different measures that we theoretically could use. And one of the things I'm really excited about is, for those of you who know me, you'll already know this about me, we're starting, our goal is really to start with something that it should be feasible with support, and we can get it off the ground. But once we have it in place, there's really an opportunity for every single hub to think about, what do we need to know about our clients? What's missing from this? What are some of the unique issues that the youth in our area experience? And then we can use this infrastructure that we've built to then measure some of those things as well. So we can both have something that's standardized, but also something that's tailored and adapted to your local context. So I think that's really exciting. this is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of, thinking about severity of mental health and substance use concerns and quality of life. There are many other things we can think about as well. And so definitely really excited to have that opportunity to work with all of you over time on that. In order for a self-reported rating scale to be successfully implemented as part of measurement-based care, it has to have low burden for both the clients and the service providers. It has to be assessing specific domains that are relevant to the population that is completing them. They have to have been selected in collaboration with clients and practitioners who will be using them, and we've done that. We've spent the last almost decade doing that piece of it, and it really has to be accompanied by that broader discussion that I've already mentioned a number of times about what the youth goals are and how all of the information comes together to build a plan that will help the young person move towards their recovery goals. Now, the question of how to do this, 10 years ago, this becomes a booklet of questionnaires that, is clipped to, and I'm sure many of you still go to your dentist or whatever, and you get a clipboard with questionnaires attached to it, and you sit in the waiting room and you fill out those questionnaires, and you may or may not, depending on the context, be concerned about the extent to which the person sitting next to you can see the information you're sharing, or how to answer the questions, how many pages there are, that kind of thing. We've really moved towards both in response to what we hear from young people, service providers, and also just the changes in the world around technology have really enabled us to now leverage technology for the administration of measurement-based care. So measurement-based care tools are easier to administer and score. The data become immediately available. So no longer do we have to go through a process of then someone, taking those questionnaires and entering them into the computer, and the computer doing some kind of machination and spitting something out at the other end, and then storing those pieces of paper and resisting the urge to just put all of that away and never use it. This, in fact, we can leverage technology. Young people can come in, they can use a tablet, which they're very familiar with using, complete some questions about themselves. Immediately that information is available. And that tablet interface, has youth input in its design, so it's user-friendly. It becomes immediately available to an interface for service providers that also has had service provider input, where you, as a service provider and a young person, can sit together and look at the information they've just shared and talk about it and integrate it into the planning. Now, in order for these feedback systems and health information technology to work, optimally it is integrated with existing systems. It's adapted to the specific context, so you don't want to just take some generic data collection system kind of thing, or something that would be used, in a restaurant and just like use it in this context. You really want to think in terms of what's our context, who's our clientele, how do we make sure that this is appropriate for young people, for example, and how do we make sure it's appropriate for the content that's being delivered. It has to be able to provide feedback in that quick turnaround. It has to be able to be accessed during a clinical encounter. It has to provide information that's easy to interpret, specific to the young person, and it has to be able to support tools that support clinical decision making. Other facilitators of implementing measurement-based care include having local champions and opinion leaders who actively associate themselves with measurement-based care, who are able to speak from a position of experience about what measurement-based care can contribute, also what are some of the challenges and how to overcome them. It's also important to have implementation teams or support teams who can support implementation more broadly who are experts in measurement-based care, who can provide technical assistance on the implementation of both the measurement-based care and the data platform. And then it's really important that we have some training that we can offer that uses active learning strategies to actually work with the measurement-based care package, both in terms of the sort of technical piece, but also in terms of thinking about like how do you introduce measurement-based care, how do you talk to young people about the results, how do you integrate the results into your service planning, what do you do if the results and your own clinical judgment or something you're saying that don't line up, how do you manage those situations? So those pieces are really important, and we're really fortunate with Youth Wellness Hubs Ontario that we have teams in place to be able to do this, and that we're able to do this on an ongoing basis over time, so that it really, the backbone is here as a support to each of the hubs in implementing this approach to care. So at this point, I've covered the content that I think, as a good starting point. And I think for each of your teams, our hope is that you might now take some time to sit together and to think about how measurement-based care can be helpful for your work, how it can be helpful for individual youth who are seeking services from your hub, for your hub overall. It is important to acknowledge the barriers that you're concerned about or that might arise in your workplace in implementing measurement-based care, but then also to think about what are the facilitators you already have in place and where might be some places or some gaps that the backbone could help you fill. So our hope is that you'll now take some time as a team to sit together and to think about these questions, create a bit of a review for yourself, an internal sort of like state of affairs that can then help sort of think through what are the next steps for you as a Youth Wellness Hubs Ontario site to getting this off the ground. These are some references that if you want more information, you can look to these references. You can also always go to our community of practice. You can send an email to our Youth Hubs email, and we can provide more information as well. And here's where our website is, and on our website you'll find a link to our community of practice. And then our email, info@youthhubs.ca, will ultimately link you with some